On this episode of Game Shack, I'm going to give you guys 7 tips for buying your first real pinball machine, coming up next. Hey everybody, welcome on back into the Game Shack. I am your host, JDV. Thanks for stopping by. If you dig this kind of content, and give me a thumbs up on the way out the door. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Well, I'm going to jump right on into it, trying to make this relatively quick video for you guys. I've owned a real pinball machine now for about 2 years, and I did about a year's worth of research before I jumped in and bought my first machine. So I think I have somewhat of a clue. Obviously, pinball is an incredibly expensive thing to buy or a hobby to get into. Brand new Stern home pins, I think, starting off now at $4,500 or $4,800, and the prices just go up from there for new machines. Even magnetical EM type machines from 1977 and before, they're now going, a lot of them go for more than $1,000. So no matter what you're looking at, you're probably looking at paying around $1,000 and up just to get into pinball. So here are 7 tips that will hopefully make that buying experience a little bit easier and get you a better machine at the end. Number 7 on my list for you guys to think about is do your homework. And what do I mean by that? I mean, essentially do research on the kind of pinball machine you want. If you know that you want a really classy looking old EM that's mint, that's a lot different than getting something like a Street Fighter game that I got out of a bar. And once you've done that, the thing I'd recommend you do next is research the game on a place like pinside.com or internationalpinballdatabase.org. Those are great reference points to kind of look and see whether or not a certain pinball game or a series of pinball games is reliable. There are some series of pinball games that are notoriously bad for first-time buyers to buy, because if one thing goes wrong, that will cause a cascading event of other things to go wrong. That's not the kind of pinball machine that you want to have in your collection. Do research on the seller. Find out if you can get replacement parts for it. The smaller number of units made of any particular model, the harder it is in theory to get parts for it. So I would recommend, as you're doing your research and looking into what games you buy, try to find pinball games that they made a lot of, because it's going to be easier to find the back glass, the flippers, the mechanics, the toys, all the things associated with fixing up or replacing parts. Playfields are going to be a lot easier if your machine was put out in great numbers. Either way, do your research all the way around and try to learn as much as you can about that machine, the company that made it, and the potentiality of replacing parts for it. Also the seller. Number 6 on my list is to make sure that when you buy the machine, have the guy who's selling it to you open up the back glass. And that's going to let you do a couple of things. One, it's going to let you see how many burnt out lights there are, if there's any kind of burn marks or other obvious electronical things wrong with it, if there are wires that are unattached or any other kind of thing that goes, you have a coat hanger here instead of a wire. Why is that? That type of thing. But the primary reason to do it is just to make sure that the back glass is actually in okay shape. A lot of times, particularly on older machines that have been around for 30 or 40 years, the back glass will look okay, but in the behind it, when you look at it, you'll be able to see that the paint is getting ready to chip off or has chipped off. Maybe somebody has painted in over it. That's something to be very aware of, because on some of the games, you're going to have a really hard time replacing that back glass if you end up wanting to do so. Again, it kind of goes back to the research point. But anyway, just check the back glass. Make sure it's quality enough to meet your needs, your demands. And if it's not, be sure that you know that you can replace that back glass at a place like Marco's. As I mentioned earlier in the video, one of the places that you can look at for a cheaper version of pinball are electromechanical machines, or EMs. Those are going to be pinball games made from 1977 and back. The one caveat about buying an EM machine is well, there's actually 2. One, make sure that you have a tech in town that can handle those. That's a lot harder to fix those old EM machines, and a lot harder to find a pinball technician that can do so. So if you're really in love with EMs, it would behoove you to try to go out to your local pinball group, Facebook group, whatever. Try to find out if there's somebody local who fixes those EM machines. And 2, when you are looking at a used EM machine, be sure that you try to pick up a 1 or 2 player game, because those are infinitely more reliable than the 4-player game. I was told directly by my pinball tech, who specializes in Gottlieb EM games, that the 4-player games are much more prone to break down than a 1 or 2-player game, like exponentially so. So he told me, if I'm ever looking for an EM game, try to find a single-player game. If not a single-player game, then a 2-player game, and try to avoid the 4-player games altogether. Kind of in that same vein of advice is my number 4 suggestion is, the more things you have on your pinball table, the more they can go wrong. And I'm particularly talking about flippers and toys. Now, every time you hit the flipper button, obviously you're activating all the flippers on either the left side or the right side. Now, if you have a pinball game that has 5 and 6 flippers, well, that's 2 and 3 times the chance of having one of those flippers burn out. And there's nothing more frustrating in a pinball game, other than it not turning on at all, than a flipper that doesn't work. Same thing goes for the toys, and those are going to be the specialized mechanics, like a TIE fighter in a Star Wars game, or a dinosaur head in Jurassic Park, or any one of 1,000 other toys that you can find in pinball games. The more toys you have, the more chances they have of breaking down. And again, going back to my first recommendation, the more rare the toy is, the more rare the game is, the harder it is going to be to replace that toy if it breaks. My third tip is to make sure that you have the seller of the game crack open the game and open up the playfield. And this is going to let you do a few things, even if you don't know anything about pinball, even if you don't know anything about electronics. See if there's any burn marks, if there's any fires. I mean, sometimes fires start in these older machines. You should be able to see if there's been any sparks anywhere. You ought to be able to see if there's any water damage, and that is absolutely possible in some of these games. You ought to be able to tell if there have rats been in there, or mice because of droppings, or urine stains. Those are all things to take a look at, because let's say you do find mice droppings in there. It is entirely possible that those mice have chewed on the wires or urinated on some of the circuitry or something like that. Just see if there's anything that is screaming out that, oh, wait a minute, no, what's this huge burn mark I have in the back of the game? If you find something like that, I would say that's a pass and move on to a game that doesn't have any of those problems. Number 2 on my list of suggestions is look for a working coin door. Now, that might be kind of odd, because this is just going in my basement or my bar, my game room or whatever. Why do I need a working coin door? Well, that's because the resale value of a pinball game that has a working coin door is going to be much higher than a pinball game that doesn't. And a lot of those people who are interested in buying pinball games are, unsurprisingly, people who run their own arcades or bars, stores that might have a pinball game. In other words, people who actually plan on making money off of these games. I was told directly by at least 3 different people who own their own arcades that they simply will not look at any game that does not have working mechanics in the coin door or absent. If you get a Stern home pin, that would be Star Wars, Jurassic Park, there's a Transformers out there, maybe a couple of other type games, but those games do not have coin doors. Well, they have a little coin door, but there's no way to actually put coins into them. And as far as I know, there is no way to put a real working coin door in those games. So even though those games are fun and every bit of the same kind of mechanics that you'll find in, say, an arcade version of those Stern games, the reality is that the resale value is not ever going to be as high as some of those other games, in part because there's no coin door. Same thing for a tilt mechanism. I understand that you probably don't need that in your own home, but the more that you can find that actually works, so that when you turn around to sell it, and after 6 months or a year, you're probably going to want to, because that's just how pinball is, it will help you to have working coin door. And the number 1 piece of advice I can give you guys when it comes to buying a used pinball game is to make sure that the playfield is in good shape, because playfields are the hardest thing by far to replace on an old pinball game. It is incredibly hard and time consuming, because you have to remove every single mechanic to do so, and that is just absolutely huge and time consuming. And of course, you have the risk, or run the risk, of damaging something as you take it out or put it in. Don't buy a pinball machine where the playfield is really jank, because coming down the line, you will probably regret it as you're playing it, and you'll definitely regret it when you go to sell it or trade it for another pinball game. Now, there are a whole lot of other things you can look at, like whether or not the bulbs have been replaced, whether or not you can upgrade the ROMs, because on some games like Meteor, I think you can change the ROM out and have a totally different game. Can you find different skins for it? Can you find different toys and all that? There's a huge amount of things to look for when you're buying pinball, but hopefully the tips I gave you do help you when you're looking for one. And if you guys have any tips that you want to share, please do so down below. We have a great community here on this channel, and I do appreciate all you guys commenting. All right, that's going to wrap this thing up. Love each other, and until next time, I'll see you guys in the Game Shack. Mwah!
Be sure to visit evilgeniusentertainment.com for exclusive content, swag, casting call news, and much, much more.